Sometimes rock bottom has a trapdoor. Harold Dorsey learned that truth while living in his truck, wondering how much lower life could push him. One night, scrolling through his cracked phone screen, he found an abandoned mansion listed for $1. He had exactly $1.13. He placed the bid and won. The house was a disaster. Rotting floors, broken windows, years of neglect everywhere he looked. But behind a hidden wall, he found something impossible. Documents and artwork worth millions, untouched for over a century. What would a desperate man do with sudden fortune? Before we get to that, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, go ahead and subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just surprise you. The photograph tucked into the sun visor had faded to the color of old honey. In it, a younger version of himself stood beside his wife and infant daughter in front of a craftsman-style home with a red door. That house was gone now. The wife was gone. Everything captured in that photograph belonged to a different life, one that felt more like a dream with each passing day. Harold Dorsey, his colleagues, had called him Hal, back when he had colleagues pressed his thumb against the photo's curled edge and let it spring back into place. The truck's interior smelled of stale fast food and the cheap soap from truck stop bathrooms. He'd been living in this Ford F-150 for 3 months now, parking in different lots each night to avoid trouble with security or police. 48 years old, and this was what his life had become. 5 years ago, Hal had been a respected architect with a small but successful firm. He'd specialized in historic renovations, breathing new life into old buildings while honoring their original character. He'd loved that work, loved the puzzle of it, figuring out how to modernize a structure without destroying what made it special. His wife, Jennifer, had managed a boutique downtown. They'd had season tickets to the theater. They'd hosted dinner parties. They'd watched their daughter, Isabel, graduate from high school and head off to college on a partial scholarship. Then, the housing market collapsed. Not the big one everyone remembers from 2008. This was smaller, regional, but just as devastating for those caught in it. New construction halted overnight. Renovation projects were cancelled. His clients, mostly small developers and private homeowners, simply stopped calling. Hal had tried to pivot, had taken on commercial work he wasn't passionate about, had bid on projects at rates that barely covered expenses. But the firm he'd built over 15 years dissolved in less than 18 months. The marriage hadn't survived much longer. Jennifer had been understanding at first, supportive even. But as the savings dwindled and the stress mounted, something between them had cracked. She'd wanted him to take any job, even if it meant giving up architecture entirely. He'd been stubborn, certain he could rebuild. By the time he'd been willing to compromise, she'd already moved on emotionally first, then physically, to her sister's place 3 states away. The divorce had been quick and surprisingly amicable, probably because there was so little left to fight over. Jennifer had taken what remained of their savings as her half. Hal had kept the truck and his drafting equipment. Isabel, 20 years old and in her junior year at State, had been devastated by the dissolution of her family. She'd tried to stay neutral, to maintain relationships with both parents, but Hal knew his failures had damaged something fundamental in their relationship. He hadn't told Isabel about the homelessness. As far as she knew, he was staying with a friend while he figured things out. The lie ate at him, but the truth felt worse, admitting to his daughter that her father was living in his truck, that he couldn't provide even basic shelter for himself. She had enough to worry about with her studies and her part-time job. She didn't need to carry the weight of his collapse, too. Since losing the apartment 3 months ago, Hal had developed a routine born of necessity. Mornings, he'd clean up at a truck stop or the gym where he'd maintained a membership, his one remaining monthly expense beyond phone service and gas. He'd work odd jobs during the day, day labor at construction sites, handyman work, anything that paid cash. The foreman liked him because he knew his way around tools and could read blueprints. They didn't ask questions about his living situation, and he didn't volunteer information. Evenings were the hardest. He'd find a parking lot, usually a 24-hour store or a quiet residential street, and settle in for the night. He'd eat whatever he could afford from dollar menus or the food bank when pride would allow it. Then he'd lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the world continuing around him, feeling invisible and forgotten. The worst part wasn't the discomfort or the uncertainty, it was the shame. Hal had spent his entire adult life building things, creating stability, being reliable. He'd been a provider, a professional, someone people respected. Now he was just another middle-aged man the world had discarded, camping in parking lots and hoping security wouldn't knock on his window. He thought about Isabel constantly. She called once a week, always cheerful, always busy with classes and friends and the life she was building. Hal would sit in his truck and talk to her, pretending everything was fine, asking about her coursework, listening to her excitement about an internship she was applying for. He'd hang up, feeling both grateful for the connection and gutted by the deception. She deserved better than this. She deserved a father who had his life together, who could offer advice and support instead of barely hanging on himself. Tonight, like most nights, Hal couldn't sleep. The parking lot lights cast harsh shadows across the truck's interior. A couple walked past, laughing about something, heading toward their car and then presumably toward their home. Hal watched them go, feeling the familiar ache of displacement. He pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked from a drop last week, spiderweb fractures spreading from the corner, but it still worked. This was his nightly ritual, scrolling through rental listings he couldn't afford, job postings that required addresses he didn't have, anything that might offer a way forward. Most nights, he found nothing but reminders of how far he'd fallen. Tonight, though, his thumb stopped on something unusual. It wasn't on the usual rental sites, but buried in a forum about estate auctions. Someone had posted a link to an obscure website, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Online estate auctions, the header read. Bidding ends midnight. Hal almost scrolled past. Then he saw the listing. Victorian mansion, built 1,883, 2.3 acres. Ironwood Springs. As is. Where is? Starting bid, $1. The photos showed a massive structure, 3 stories of peeling paint and broken windows. The front porch sagged dangerously. Weeds had reclaimed the yard. It looked like something from a horror movie, the kind of place that should have been condemned decades ago. But Hal's trained eye saw past the decay. He saw the ornate woodwork, the tall windows, the grand proportions. Someone had built this with care once, with skill and vision. It was dying now, but the bones were good. The structure was solid Victorian construction. They'd built things to last back then. He checked the auction details. 3 bids so far, all at the $1 minimum. The listing was sparse, just an address, the acreage, and a note that the property was being sold to settle estate taxes. No interior photos. No inspection reports. No guarantees of any kind. Hal looked at his bank balance. $1.13. This was insane. Even if he won, what would he do with an abandoned mansion 3 hours away? He had no money for repairs, no way to make it habitable. It would just be another failure, another thing he'd reached for and lost. But something about the house called to him. Maybe it was the architect in him, seeing potential where others saw ruin. Maybe it was desperation, the drowning man's instinct to grab at anything floating by. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just needed to believe that for $1 a man could buy hope. The auction ended in 40 minutes. Hal's finger hovered over the bid button. $1 was $1. He'd need gas tomorrow to get to a job site. That dollar could mean the difference between working and sitting idle. Or it could buy a chance. His phone rang, startling him. Isabel's name appeared on the screen. He almost didn't answer. It was late for her to be calling, but worry overrode hesitation. Belle, everything okay? Hi, Dad. Yeah, I'm fine. Just wanted to hear your voice. She sounded tired. Rough week. Midterms and work and everything. I'm sorry, sweetheart. You hanging in there? Yeah, I just... She paused. I miss when things were normal, you know, when we were all together, when life made sense. Hal closed his eyes against the wave of guilt. I know. I miss that too. Are you doing okay? Really? I'm managing, he said, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't exactly the truth either. They talked for 15 minutes, Isabel sharing details about her classes, complaining about a difficult professor, laughing about something her roommate had done. Hal listened, grateful for the normalcy of it, the reminder that not everything in his life had fallen apart. After they hung up, he sat in the darkness, thinking about legacy and responsibility and what it meant to be a father when you had nothing left to give. He looked at the phone. 23 minutes until the auction closed. Hal thought about Isabel, about the life she was building, about the fact that he couldn't even offer her a place to stay if she needed one. He thought about the years of work that had led to nothing, about the skills he still possessed, even if no one wanted to pay for them anymore. He thought about the mansion broken, abandoned, forgotten, and saw something of himself in it. $1. One chance. One desperate bid against the certainty of continued failure. Hal placed the bid. Then he closed his eyes and waited, not sure if he was hoping to win or hoping to lose, knowing only that he'd made a choice, taken an action, done something other than passively accepting his circumstances. At 11:47 p.m., his phone chimed with an email notification. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder for property #4782 Victorian Estate, Ironwood Springs. Hal stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Nobody had outbid him. In the final 13 minutes of the auction, not a single person had raised the stakes. He'd won an entire mansion for $1. He read the email 3 times, making sure it was real, that he wasn't hallucinating from exhaustion and despair. It was real. The property was his, or would be once he signed the paperwork. Hal sat in his truck in the parking lot darkness, holding his cracked phone, and for the first time in months he felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. Hal barely slept. He spent the rest of the night researching, his phone's battery draining as he learned everything he could about Ironwood Springs and the property he'd just acquired. The town had been a mill town once, prosperous in the late 1800s, slowly dying ever since. Current population, just under 3,000. The downtown consisted of a few blocks of historic buildings, half of them empty. The local economy relied on a grain processing plant and not much else. He found the mansion on a satellite map. It sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. The structure's footprint was enormous. The house had to be at least 5,000 square feet, maybe more. Even from the aerial view, he could see missing roof tiles and what looked like a collapsed section of the back porch. By dawn, Hal had made his decision. He'd drive to Ironwood Springs, sign the papers, see the property with his own eyes. If it was as bad as he feared, he'd figure out what to do then. But he had to see it. Had to know if this desperate bid had been inspired hope or just another mistake in a series of mistakes. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Hal's truck protested the highway speeds, a worrying rattle developing somewhere in the engine around mile 50. He stopped once for gas and a bathroom break, counting out bills from his dwindling cash with careful precision. He bought a protein bar for breakfast and ate it while driving, trying not to think about what he was doing, what he'd committed to. The landscape changed gradually as he drove. Flat farmland gave way to rolling hills covered in pine. The towns grew smaller and farther apart. Finally, a faded green sign announced Ironwood Springs, population 2,847. The downtown was exactly as empty as his research had suggested. A few pickup trucks angled against the curb in front of a diner. The old movie theater had been converted into an antique store. Half the storefronts displayed "for lease" signs in dusty windows. It was the kind of place people left, not the kind they moved to. Hal followed the GPS directions to the attorney's office, a small brick building squeezed between a hardware store and what used to be a bank. Inside, an elderly woman at a desk looked up from her paperwork with barely concealed surprise. "Help you? I have an appointment with Mr. Garrison about the Ashford property." Her eyebrows rose. "You're the buyer?" The attorney, when he appeared, was a man in his 70s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Mr. Dorsey, I'll admit, I was surprised anyone bid on the place. You understand it's being sold as is? No warranties, no guarantees of habitability?" "I understand," Hal said. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Garrison explained that the property had been in legal limbo for decades, something about disputed inheritance and unpaid taxes. The county had finally foreclosed and put it up for auction just to get it off the books. There were no liens, no outstanding claims. Once Hal signed, it was his, free and clear. "One piece of advice," Garrison said as he handed over the deed and an old iron key. "The place has been empty since the mid-90s. If you're planning to do anything with it, be careful. Structure could be unsound. We had an inspector look at it years back, said the foundation was solid, but that was a long time ago." "Thank you," Hal said, pocketing the key. Its weight felt significant, real. The mansion stood 3 miles outside town, at the end of a long gravel drive choked with weeds. Hal's first glimpse through the windshield made his stomach drop. The photos hadn't lied, but they hadn't captured the full scale of the decay. The Victorian structure loomed 3 stories tall, its once elegant facade scarred by peeling paint and water damage. Several windows on the upper floors were broken, dark holes staring out like empty eyes. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously on one side. Vines had claimed the eastern wall, crawling up toward the peaked roof, where shingles were missing in patches. Hal sat in the truck for a long moment, engine idling, staring at what he'd bought. This was worse than he'd imagined. This was impossible. Even with unlimited funds and a full crew, restoring this place would take years. And he had neither funds nor crew, just $1.13 minus the dollar he'd spent on the bid. He should leave, drive away, let the county reclaim it for unpaid taxes or whatever would happen next. Cut his losses at $1 and forget this moment of desperate foolishness. Instead, he turned off the engine and got out of the truck. The front steps groaned under his weight, but they held. Hal tested each board carefully before trusting it, his architectural training automatically assessing structural integrity. The porch had good bones under the rot, solid timber construction, just weathered and neglected. The iron key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door swung inward with a horror movie creak that would have been funny under different circumstances. The entry hall was grand, or had been once. A staircase swept upward to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate details beneath layers of dust. The ceiling soared 15 feet above him, decorated with molding that would have cost a fortune to replicate today. But the wallpaper hung in strips, water stains bloomed across the plaster, and the wooden floor was warped and buckled in places. Hal walked through the ground floor in a daze. The house was massive: parlor, dining room, library, kitchen, and several rooms whose original purposes he could only guess. Every surface was coated in decades of accumulated dust and debris, bird droppings beneath broken windows, the smell of mold and rot, evidence of small animals nesting in corners. And yet, the bones were good. Despite everything, the structure stood. The walls were plumb. The floors, though damaged, were solid hardwood beneath the grime. Someone had built this house to last, had poured money and skill into its construction. It was dying, yes, but it hadn't died yet. Hal found himself in what must have been the library. Built-in bookshelves lined 3 walls, empty now except for rodent nests and debris. In the corner, almost hidden behind accumulated trash, he spotted something, a hand pump, the old-fashioned kind that drew water from a well. He approached it, placed his hand on the iron handle, and pressed down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, water began to flow, rusty at first, then running clear and cold into the basin below. It was such a small thing. But in that moment, with water flowing for the first time in decades, Hal felt something shift inside him. This house was broken, yes. It was overwhelming, impractical, possibly beyond saving. But it was his. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, documenting damage with his phone camera, making mental notes of what would need to be addressed first. The back section of the house had suffered the worst. The roof there was nearly gone, and water damage had rotted through floors in several places. But the front section, particularly the ground floor, was more salvageable than he'd initially thought. As the sun began to set, Hal stood in the entry hall and faced a decision. He could drive back tonight, return to his truck and his parking lot existence, try to figure out what to do with this property from a distance. Or he could stay. He had a sleeping bag in the truck. He had water from the pump. He had shelter, damaged shelter, but 4 walls and a roof. Hal went to the truck and retrieved his camping equipment. He set up in the library, the room that seemed most structurally sound. He boarded the broken window with cardboard. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, for the first time in 3 months, Hal slept inside. The house settled and creaked around him, unfamiliar sounds that kept him half awake. But he wasn't in a parking lot. He wasn't waiting for security to knock on his window. He was in his own space, on his own property. He thought about calling Isabel, telling her what he'd done. But what would he say? That he'd spent his last dollar on an abandoned mansion? That he was now technically a homeowner, but still essentially homeless? That he'd traded one impossible situation for another? No. He'd wait. He'd figure out what this meant, what he could do with it, before involving her in another one of his failures. As he drifted toward sleep, Hal's mind was already working on plans. First priority, make the place secure and weatherproof. Second, figure out how to make money while living here. Third, decide if this was a temporary shelter or something more. But underneath the practical planning was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. This house was a project. A massive, overwhelming, probably impossible project. But it was something to work toward, something to build, something that needed his skills and knowledge. For the first time since everything fell apart, Hal Dorsey had a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just survival. He had a house to save, and maybe, in saving it, he'd find a way to save himself. The next morning, Hal woke stiff and cold but oddly energized. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating particles of dust floating in the air like snow. He used the hand pump to wash his face, the cold water shocking him fully awake. He needed a plan. He needed income. And he needed to figure out if this gamble was the worst decision he'd ever made, or somehow, impossibly, the beginning of something better. Standing in the grand entry hall, surrounded by decay and possibility, Hal pulled out his phone and took a photo. Then he opened a new message to Isabel. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could he say? Finally, he typed, "Things are changing, Belle. I'll call you soon. Love you." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then he got to work. Morning light revealed the full extent of what Hal had taken on. He spent the first hours doing a systematic assessment of the house, moving through each room with his old clipboard, making notes. The damage was extensive but not uniform. The back section had suffered the worst, the roof there was nearly gone, and water damage had rotted through floors in several places. But the front section, particularly the ground floor, was more salvageable than he'd initially thought. The mansion's layout revealed itself slowly. Grand parlor to the right of the entry hall, formal dining room to the left, with a butler's pantry leading to a massive kitchen. The library where he'd slept, a study with built-in cabinets, a small conservatory with shattered glass panels. Upstairs, 6 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and what looked like servants' quarters on the 3rd floor. 5,000 square feet minimum, Hal calculated, maybe more. His architectural training kicked in, despite the overwhelming scope of the work. First priority, secure the structure against further damage. Second, establish basic utilities. Third, make one space truly livable. Everything else could wait. He chose a bedroom on the 2nd floor for himself, not too large, with a window that still had glass and flooring that seemed stable. He spent the morning sweeping it clean, scrubbing the walls and floor with water from the hand pump, patching the worst cracks in the plaster with joint compound he'd found in the truck's toolbox. By afternoon, he had a space. He hung a blanket over the window for privacy. He set up his sleeping bag on a foam pad. It wasn't much, but it was a room, a space that belonged to him alone. The next challenge was the windows. Hal counted 18 broken panes on the ground floor alone. He couldn't afford to replace them all, but he could board them properly. The problem was supplies and money to buy them. He drove into town, his truck's rattle growing more pronounced. The hardware store was called Brennan's, and the owner, a man near Hal's age with carpenter's hands, looked up from his register as Hal entered. "Help you find something?" "Plywood," Hal said. "1/4 inch if you have it, and a box of deck screws." The owner studied him for a moment. "You're the fellow who bought the Ashford place." Small towns, Hal thought. News travelled fast. "That's right." "Huh." The man walked him back to the lumber section. "Folks around here thought that house would just fall down eventually, figured the county would eventually bulldoze it." "It's not that far gone," Hal said, running his hand over a sheet of plywood. "You planning to flip it? Planning to live in it?" The owner's eyebrows rose. "Live in it? With what utilities?" "I'm working on that," Hal said, which wasn't exactly a lie. They settled on 3 sheets of plywood and a pound of screws. At the register, the owner rang it up. "That'll be $47. Hal had $63 left from his last day labor job. He handed over the bills, watched his resources dwindle further. "Name's Pierce, by the way," the owner said, bagging the screws. "You need work done on that place? I've got some experience with old houses. Did restoration work before I took over the store." "I appreciate that," Hal said. "Right now, I'm just trying to make it weatherproof." "Fair enough." Pierce paused. "Listen, I know it's none of my business, but that house, there's history there. Clifton Ashford built it, back in 1883. He was one of the good ones, you know. Did right by people when most folks didn't. Just thought you should know what you've got." Hal carried the plywood to his truck, Pierce's words echoing in his mind. History. The house had history. He'd been so focused on the decay that he hadn't considered what it had been before the neglect, who had lived there, what stories it held. Back at the mansion, he spent the rest of the afternoon boarding windows. It was meditative work, measuring and cutting, drilling pilot holes, driving screws. Each secured panel made the house feel a little less vulnerable, a little more like shelter. As the sun set, he heard footsteps on the gravel drive. Hal tensed, moving toward the door. A moment later, a woman appeared at the front entrance, elderly, probably in her 70s, with steel grey hair pulled back in a bun. "Didn't mean to startle you," she called out. "I'm your neighbour, Grace Sutherland. Saw you moving around yesterday and thought I'd introduce myself." Hal relaxed slightly. "Hal Dorsey." Grace stepped carefully onto the porch, eyeing the boards with a practiced gaze. "You're actually planning to live here? In this house?" "I am," Hal said, hearing the defensiveness in his voice. "Well." Grace looked at the boarded windows, at Hal's work-worn hands. Something in her expression softened. "I suppose someone should. Been too long empty." She reached into her bag. "Brought you some bread. Baked it this morning. Figured you probably don't have much in the way of food yet." The gesture caught Hal off guard. "That's very kind of you." "It's bread," Grace said gruffly. Not kindness, but her eyes were gentle. You should know, this house has a reputation in town. People say it's haunted, cursed, all kinds of nonsense. It's all foolishness, mind you, but folks believe what they want to believe. I'm not afraid of ghosts, Hal said. Grace smiled at that. Good man. Houses aren't haunted. They're just old and full of memories. She turned to leave, then paused. If you need anything, water, phone, whatever, my place is the white farmhouse about a quarter-mile that way. The one with the green roof. Thank you, Hal said, and meant it. After Grace left, Hal broke the bread and ate slowly, savoring each bite. It was fresh and warm, probably the best thing he'd eaten in weeks. He sat on the front steps as darkness settled over the property, thinking about neighbors and kindness, and the fact that someone had noticed him, had thought of him, had brought him food. That night, by lantern light, he sat in the library and called Isabel. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless. Dad, I was just thinking about you. Your text yesterday was so cryptic. What's going on? Hal took a breath. Time to stop lying, at least partially. Belle, I need to tell you something. Things have been harder than I let on. I lost my apartment 3 months ago. I've been living in the truck. Silence on the other end. Then, Dad, why didn't you tell me? Because you're in school. You're building your life. You don't need to worry about me. Of course I worry about you. You're my father. Her voice cracked slightly. Where are you now? Are you still in the truck? No. That's what I needed to tell you. I bought a house. You... What? I know it sounds crazy. It's a long story. But I have a place now. It needs work, a lot of work, but it's shelter. It's something. Isabel was quiet for a moment. Dad, are you okay? Really okay? I'm getting there, Hal said. I think I might actually be getting there. They talked for another hour, Hal explaining about the auction, the mansion, the condition of the place. Isabel listened, asked questions, and gradually her concern shifted to cautious interest. Can I come see it? She asked. Maybe over fall break? I'd like that, Hal said. Give me a few weeks to make it more presentable. But yes, I'd really like that. After they hung up, Hal sat in the darkness, feeling lighter than he had in months. He'd told her the truth, not all of it, but enough. And she hadn't rejected him, hadn't been ashamed. She'd wanted to help, wanted to visit, wanted to be part of whatever this was. He walked through the dark house with a flashlight, seeing it with fresh eyes. This wasn't just shelter anymore. This was something he could share with his daughter, something they could work on together, something that might help bridge the gap his failures had created between them. In the study, a room he hadn't fully explored yet, Hal opened the desk drawers empty, except for dust and a few dried leaves. But in the top drawer, something caught his eye. A brass compass, small enough to fit in his palm, tarnished but intact. He turned it over. Engraved on the back, True North. Hal stood there in the darkness, holding someone else's compass, thinking about direction and purpose and second chances. Tomorrow he'd need to find work, real work that paid more than day labor. He'd need to figure out utilities, deal with whatever permits and inspections might be required. The list of impossible tasks stretched ahead of him like a mountain range. But tonight, in this old house with its history and its possibilities, Hal felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The routine established itself over the next 2 weeks. Mornings, Hal would drive into town and check in at Brennan's Hardware, where Pierce had offered him part-time work. The pay wasn't much, $12 an hour, 20 hours a week, but it was steady, and Pierce let him take home damaged or discontinued items at cost. The work was straightforward, stocking shelves, cutting lumber, mixing paint, helping customers find what they needed. Hal found comfort in it, the simplicity of tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. Pierce was easy to work with, offering advice about the mansion without being pushy, sharing stories about other restoration projects he'd been involved with over the years. "The Ashford place has good bones," Pierce told him one afternoon while they unloaded a delivery. "Foundation's solid, that's what matters most. Everything else you can fix eventually." "Eventually is the key word," Hal said. "I'm starting to understand why it sold for $1. Pierce laughed. "Most people would have walked away. The fact that you're still there says something. Says I'm stubborn or stupid. Maybe both. But those aren't always bad qualities in restoration work." Hal used his lunch breaks to research at the town library. It was small, just 3 rooms in an old brick building, but it had internet access and a friendly librarian named Ruth who didn't ask why a grown man spent his breaks reading about historic preservation and 19th century architecture. He started researching Clifton Ashford. What he found surprised him. Ashford had been born in 1841 to a wealthy Philadelphia family. He'd studied law but never practiced, instead becoming involved in the abolitionist movement. When the Civil War ended, he'd moved to Ironwood Springs and built the mansion in 1883. The town records mentioned him occasionally: donations to the school, contributions to the church, service on various civic committees. But most interesting were the references Hal found in a digitized collection of regional newspapers. Several articles from the 1882nd and 92nd mentioned Ashford's charitable work and his assistance to travelers. One obituary from 1897 called him a friend to all who sought refuge. The language was vague, but Hal recognized the coded terminology. Ashford had been part of something larger, something the newspapers couldn't openly discuss. The Underground Railroad had officially ended with the Civil War, but networks of assistance had continued for years afterward, helping displaced people find new lives, new opportunities. Ashford's mansion, isolated on the edge of town, would have been perfectly positioned for such work. Hal drove back to the mansion that afternoon with a new understanding of the house's architecture. Those odd features he'd noticed, the multiple entrances, the unusual layout of the basement, the way certain rooms seemed to lead to unexpected spaces, weren't just Victorian eccentricity. They were design elements with purpose. That evening, he explored more systematically. In the basement, behind a shelf unit that had collapsed years ago, Hal found a small door, barely 4 feet high. It opened onto a narrow passage that ran beneath the front parlor, emerging in what had once been a root cellar. A hidden passage, a way to move through the house unseen. Hal stood in the passage, his flashlight beam cutting through decades of darkness, and felt a connection to the man who'd built this place. Ashford had used his wealth and skills to help people who had nothing, who were starting over, who needed someone to believe in them. In a way, Hal thought, Ashford was still helping people, still providing shelter to someone starting over. Over the following days, Hal found other hidden spaces. A compartment behind the study's bookshelf, a false panel in the third-floor hallway. Each discovery felt like a conversation with the house's builder, understanding the man through his architecture. 2 weeks after moving in, Hal's phone rang while he was working on the roof, patching holes with salvaged shingles Pierce had given him at cost. Isabel's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, Belle. Dad, I've been thinking about fall break. I want to come see the house, but I also want to help. I can bring some friends if you need extra hands. We could make it a work weekend." Hal's throat tightened. "You don't have to do that. You should enjoy your break." "I want to help," Isabel insisted. "Besides, I'm curious. My dad bought a mansion for $1. That's kind of amazing." "It's kind of insane," Hal corrected, but he was smiling. "That too. So what do you say? 3 weeks from now, me and maybe 2 friends, we'll bring tools and energy drinks and terrible music." "I'd love that," Hal said. "I really would." After they hung up, Hal sat on the roof, looking out over the property, the overgrown fields, the line of trees in the distance, the town visible as a cluster of buildings a few miles away. Isabel was coming. His daughter was choosing to be part of this, to help him build something instead of watching him fail. That night, working in the study by lantern light, Hal noticed something odd about the wall paneling. The boards ran vertically throughout the room, except for one section behind the built-in bookshelf where they ran horizontally. It was subtle, the kind of detail most people would miss, but his architectural training made it stand out. He pulled the empty bookshelf away from the wall, years of accumulated dust cascading to the floor. Up close, he could see a faint seam in the paneling, barely visible but definitely there. He ran his fingers along the edge, feeling for a latch or hinge. Nothing. He tried pressing different panels, looking for a hidden release. Still nothing. The seam was real, but he couldn't figure out how to access whatever was behind it. Hal spent an hour examining the wall from every angle, testing various theories about hidden mechanisms. The Victorian era had been full of such things, secret compartments, hidden rooms, clever architectural puzzles, but this one eluded him. Finally, frustrated, he stepped back. There had to be a trigger somewhere, some way to open the panel. He studied the surrounding woodwork, looking for anything unusual. Then he saw a carved rosette in the molding above the bookshelf, slightly different from the others in the room. It looked decorative, but when Hal pressed it, he felt it give slightly under his fingers. Something clicked. A section of the wall, about 3 feet wide, swung inward an inch. Hal's pulse quickened. He carefully pulled the panel open. Behind it was darkness, a space that his flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. He could see that it was small, maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. A hidden room, completely sealed from the outside world. This was more than just a hidden passage. This was a room that Clifton Ashford had deliberately concealed, that had remained sealed for over a century. Whatever was inside had been preserved exactly as Ashford had left it. Hal stood at the threshold, flashlight in hand, and felt the weight of the moment. He could step inside, explore immediately, or he could wait, document properly, approach this discovery with the care it deserved. The architect in him won out. Tomorrow, with better lighting and his camera, he'd explore the room properly. Tonight, he'd simply acknowledge what he'd found. He closed the panel carefully, making sure it latched properly. Then he sat at Ashford's desk and pulled out his phone, making notes about the discovery, sketching the mechanism, planning his approach for tomorrow. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The house settled with its familiar creaks and groans, and Hal sat in the study, surrounded by history and possibility, thinking about hidden rooms and the secrets they kept. Whatever was behind that wall had been waiting for over a century. It could wait one more night. But Hal barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities. What had Ashford hidden? Why had he built such an elaborate concealment? What would a man like that, wealthy, principled, committed to helping others, choose to preserve in secret? By dawn, Hal was back in the study with his best flashlight, his phone fully charged for photographs, and a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt since his first major architectural discovery as a young professional. He pressed the rosette. The panel clicked and swung open. Hal stepped inside the hidden room, and his breath caught in his throat. The space was a study within a study, preserved like a time capsule. A desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with papers held down by an old inkwell. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes. Several framed pictures hung on the walls. But it was the papers on the desk that drew his attention. He moved closer, careful not to disturb anything, and began to read. The handwriting was elegant, precise. A journal entry dated April 1889. Today, I helped the Morrison family, husband, wife, 3 children, continue their journey north. The youngest, barely 6 years old, reminded me why this work matters. What we do in darkness, history will judge in light. Hal's hands trembled as he reached for his phone and began taking photographs. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was history, and it had been waiting for him to find it. Hal spent 2 hours in the hidden room that first morning, carefully documenting everything without touching more than necessary. He photographed the journals, the books, the artwork on the walls. He took wide shots, showing the room's layout and close-ups, capturing details, dates, names, the elegant script of Ashford's handwriting. When he finally emerged, his mind was racing. What he'd found wasn't just historically interesting, it was potentially significant. Personal accounts from the post-Civil War era were rare. Detailed records of assistance networks were even rarer. What Clifton Ashford had preserved could fill gaps in historical understanding, could put names and faces to stories that had been lost. But valuable things attracted attention, and attention was something Hal wasn't sure he was ready for. He spent the weekend researching document preservation and historical authentication. What he learned both excited and terrified him. If the documents were genuine, and everything about them suggested they could be extraordinarily valuable, not just monetarily, but historically. The journals spanned nearly 15 years, from 1883 to 1897. Ashford had written in a clear, methodical hand, recording dates, names, circumstances. Some entries were brief. The Johnson family arrived tonight, provided them with provisions and directions to the next station. Others were longer, more personal, revealing Ashford's thoughts and motivations. One entry from 1891 particularly struck Hal. "I am often asked why I continue this work when the war is long over, when slavery is abolished. But freedom on paper is not freedom in practice. These families still flee persecution, still seek safety, still need allies. My father's wealth built this house. I choose to use it for something that matters." The books on the shelves were first editions: Dickens, Hawthorne, Whitman. Several had inscriptions from the authors themselves. The framed artwork on the walls included what Hal was fairly certain were original prints, though he lacked the expertise to be sure. On Monday, during his lunch break, Hal called the number for the historical society he'd found on the town's website. A woman answered on the third ring. "Ironwood Springs Historical Society. This is Patricia." "Hello, my name is Hal Dorsey. I recently purchased the Ashford mansion, and I've found some items that might be of historical interest. I was hoping to speak with someone about them." There was a pause. "The Ashford mansion? You actually bought that place?" "I did." "Well." Patricia's tone shifted, becoming more professional. "I'm the preservation coordinator for the society. What kind of items are we talking about?" Hal chose his words carefully. "Documents, primarily. Personal journals, correspondence, some books, and artwork. Everything appears to be from the late 1800s. "How many documents?" "I'm not sure exactly. Several journals, numerous letters. I haven't inventoried everything yet." Another pause. "Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to come take a look, if you're amenable. Would tomorrow work? Say 2 o'clock? That would be fine." After hanging up, Hal sat in his truck outside the hardware store, wondering if he'd made a mistake. Once other people knew about the hidden room, he couldn't unring that bell. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd found. These weren't his stories to keep secret. That evening, Hal called Isabel and told her about the discovery. "Wait, you found a secret room full of historical documents?" "Dad, that's incredible." "It is. But it's also complicated. If these things are as valuable as I think they might be, everything changes." "Changes how?" Hal looked around the library, at his camping equipment and makeshift living situation. "I don't know yet. That's what worries me." "Dad," Isabel said carefully, "you know you could sell them, right? If they're valuable, you could actually get some stability, fix up the house properly. Stop living like you're camping." "I know. But there's something about that idea that feels wrong. Ashford preserved these things for a reason. He kept this record for a reason. Selling them to the highest bidder, I don't think that's what he'd want. He's been dead for over a century. You're allowed to make decisions that help you. I know that too, Hal said. But let me see what the Historical Society says first. Then I'll figure out what to do. The next afternoon, Patricia arrived in a sedan that had seen better days. She was in her mid-50s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She surveyed the mansion with obvious interest. "I've lived in Ironwood Springs my entire life, and I've never been inside this house," she said. "The Ashford family kept to themselves, and after Clifton died, it became tied up in legal disputes. By the time those were resolved, everyone who remembered the family was gone." Hal led her inside, noticing how she paused to examine architectural details, the carved woodwork, the ceiling medallions, the craftsmanship that had survived decades of neglect. "The house itself is historically significant," she said. "One of the finest examples of Victorian architecture in the region. But you said you found documents?" "This way." In the study, Hal showed her the hidden panel mechanism. Patricia's eyes widened as the wall swung open. "I had no idea," she breathed. "Priest holes. We always suspected Ashford was involved in assistance networks, but we never had proof." Hal led her into the hidden room. For a long moment, Patricia simply stood there, taking it in. Then she moved to the desk, leaning close to read the journal entries without touching anything. "Oh my God," she whispered. "These are primary sources, first-hand accounts. Do you understand what this means?" "I think so," Hal said. Patricia turned to face him, and her expression was serious. "Mr. Dorsey, Hal, what you've found here is potentially one of the most significant historical discoveries in this region in decades. These documents need to be properly preserved, authenticated, studied. They need to be in a climate-controlled environment. They need to be—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. This is your property, your discovery. I'm getting ahead of myself." "What would you recommend?" Hal asked. "Let me bring in some colleagues, historians from the State University, an archivist, maybe an art appraiser. With your permission, of course. We need to document everything properly, assess condition, determine authenticity. Then we can discuss options. Options for what happens to the collection." Patricia met his eyes. "I won't lie to you. This could be worth significant money. Private collectors would pay dearly for documents like these. But it could also be donated to a museum or university, preserved for public benefit. There are various arrangements possible. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Hal nodded slowly. "All right, bring in your experts." Over the next week, the mansion became a hub of quiet activity. Patricia returned with 3 colleagues, a historian from the State University, an archivist specializing in 19th century documents, and an art history professor. They worked carefully, methodically, photographing and cataloging everything in the hidden room. Hal watched them work during his off hours, learning more about what he'd found. The journals documented over 200 individuals and families that Ashford had assisted between 1883 and 1897. Some of the names matched historical records, confirming routes and destinations that historians had only theorized about. Others were completely unknown, adding new stories to the historical record. The artwork included 3 original prints by Winslow Homer, a small painting by Eastman Johnson, and several pieces by lesser-known but period-significant artists. The book's 43 first editions, many inscribed, represented a significant collection of American and British literature from the era. On the 5th day, the historian, a woman named Dr. Louise Kimball, sat down with Hal in the library. "We've completed our preliminary assessment," she said. "Everything is authentic. The journals, the correspondence, the artwork, the books. It's all genuine, and it's all significant." "What does that mean, in practical terms?" Dr. Kimball leaned forward. "In practical terms, The artwork alone could be worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million at auction. The books, another $500,000. The documents are harder to value, they're priceless from a historical perspective, but in terms of market value, probably another million or more. We're talking about a collection worth potentially $5 million. The number hit Hal like a physical blow. $5 million. Enough to solve every problem he had, enough to give Isabel her college tuition without loans, enough to start over, completely. But, Dr. Kimball continued, there's something else you should consider. This collection tells a story. It documents real people, real lives, real courage. If it's broken up and sold to private collectors, that story gets fragmented, lost. If it's donated or sold to an institution that can preserve and display it properly, it remains intact. It becomes something that can educate, inspire, mean something beyond its monetary value. You're asking me to give up $5 million. I'm asking you to consider what Clifton Ashford would have wanted, Doctor, Kimball said gently. He preserved these things for a reason. He kept this record for a reason. The question is, what reason? That night, Hal sat in the hidden room, surrounded by Ashford's journals and artifacts, feeling the weight of impossible decisions. $5 million. The number kept repeating in his mind like a mantra. He could pay off every debt, secure Isabel's future, live comfortably for the rest of his life. But something about that path felt wrong. He opened one of the journals and began reading, looking for guidance from a man who'd been dead for over a century. He found it in an entry from 1896, one of the last entries Ashford had made. I am an old man now, and I wonder who will come after me. I wonder if anyone will understand why I kept these records, why this work mattered so deeply. I hope that someday someone will find this room and these papers. I hope they will understand that wealth is not what we accumulate, but what we do with what we have. I hope they will choose wisely. Hal closed the journal and sat in the darkness, thinking about choices and legacy and what it meant to do right by a man he'd never met, but felt he was beginning to understand. The next morning, Pierce found him at the hardware store, looking exhausted. You all right? You look like you haven't slept. I haven't much, Hal admitted. Been thinking about what to do with what I found. The historical stuff? Pierce leaned against the counter. Word's gotten around town. People are talking about it. Some are excited, think it'll put Ironwood Springs on the map. Others are worried you'll sell everything off to some collector and that'll be the end of it. What do you think I should do? Pierce considered the question. I think you should do what feels right, not what feels easy. But I also think you deserve to benefit from your discovery. You're the one living in that wreck of a house, working for $12 an hour, trying to make something work. Don't let people guilt you into giving away your chance at stability. Hal appreciated the honest answer, even if it didn't make the decision any clearer. That afternoon, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the mansion. He introduced himself as Randall Peck, a developer who'd been buying properties in the region. Mr. Dorsey, I'll be direct. I'm prepared to offer you $400,000 for this property and all its contents. Cash sale, close in 30 days. Hal studied the man. 400,000. That's right. I understand you've found some interesting items. I have connections with collectors who'd be very interested in acquiring them. We'd handle all of that. You'd walk away with $400,000, clean and simple. The collection is worth significantly more than $400,000. Peck smiled. Perhaps, but selling it yourself would be complicated. Authentication, auctions, dealing with museums and universities, all of that takes time and expertise. My offer gives you immediate liquidity. Sometimes the bird in hand is worth more than what's in the bush. I'll think about it, Hal said. Don't think too long. Offer expires in 1 week. Peck handed him a business card. I'm staying at the inn in town. Call me when you're ready. After Peck left, Hal stood on the porch, feeling the pressure mounting. 400,000 was real money, money that could change his life. But it was also a fraction of what the collection was worth, and something about Peck's smooth confidence made Hal uneasy. He called Patricia. "A developer named Randall Peck just offered me $400,000 for the house and everything in it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Peck, he's been buying up properties all over the region, flips them usually, sometimes develops them. He's aggressive. Should I take it? That's not for me to say. But Hal, if you're asking my opinion, $400,000 is insulting given what you've found. Peck knows that. He's betting you're desperate enough to take the first offer. What if I am that desperate? Then take it, but give me 24 hours first. Let me make some calls. There might be other options." That evening, Isabel called. Her fall break was 2 weeks away, and she was making plans for the visit. "I've got 2 friends who want to come help my roommate, and a guy from my architecture class. He's actually really interested in historic preservation." "That's great, Belle. I'm looking forward to it." "Dad, you sound tired. Are you okay?" Hal considered lying, then decided against it. "I'm trying to make a big decision about what to do with what I found, and I'm not sure what the right choice is. Do you want to talk about it?" He told her about the collection's value, about Peck's offer, about Dr. Kimball's suggestion that he preserve the collection intact rather than selling it off. $5 million versus 400,000, Isabel said slowly. "That's a big difference." "It is, but it's more complicated than just the money." "Why?" "Because Ashford preserved this for a reason. He wanted someone to find it, to understand it, to do something meaningful with it. Taking Peck's offer feels like betraying that trust." Isabel was quiet for a moment. "Dad, I love that you care about honoring this man's legacy, but you're also allowed to care about yourself, about us. You've been struggling for so long. If this is your chance to stop struggling, maybe that matters too." "Maybe," Hal said. "Or maybe this is my chance to do something that matters more than money. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, you know. Maybe there's a way to honor the legacy and still take care of yourself." After they hung up, Hal sat with his daughter's words. She was right, the choice wasn't binary. There had to be middle ground, some way to preserve what Ashford had created while also securing his own future. The next morning, Patricia called with news. "I spoke with the State Historical Commission. They're very interested in what you've found. They're proposing a partnership, establish the Ashford House as a historical site and museum operated by a non-profit. The collection would remain here, preserved and displayed. You would serve as curator and caretaker with a salary and housing provided." "How much salary?" $45,000 a year, plus free housing in a renovated section of the house. It's not a fortune, but it's stable." Hal did the math. 45,000 was more than he'd made in the past year. With no rent or mortgage, it would be comfortable. Not wealthy, but secure. "There's a catch," Patricia continued. "The renovation would cost at least $500,000. The commission can provide some funding, but not all of it. We'd need to raise the rest through grants, donations, community support." "How long would that take?" "Optimistically, a year, maybe 2. You'd be living in construction during that time." "I'm already living in construction," Hal said. "True. There's one more thing. Randall Peck has filed a formal expression of interest with the county. He's claiming that the property should be rezoned for commercial development. It's preliminary, but it could complicate things." Hal felt anger rise in his chest. "He made an offer, I haven't even responded, and he's already trying to force my hand. That's how he operates. Pressure on multiple fronts until people give in." "Well, he picked the wrong person to pressure," Hal said. "Tell the Historical Commission I'm interested in their proposal. Let's see if we can make it work." Over the following week, Hal met with commission representatives, reviewed architectural plans for the renovation, and began to understand the scope of what he was committing to. It would be hard work, years of it, but it would also be meaningful work, work that honored Ashford's legacy while giving Hal a purpose beyond survival. Grace Sutherland appeared one evening while Hal was working on the porch. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about what you're trying to do here, about what Eleanor Ashford would have wanted. I have something to tell you, and something to offer you." She sat down on the steps beside him. Eleanor Ashford was my second cousin. I didn't know her well, she was quite a bit older than me, but I knew her story. She discovered the hidden room in the 1970 seconds, contacted some historians, got offers to sell everything, but she refused. She told me once that some things were more important than money, that legacy meant more than comfort. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "Because I wanted to see what kind of man you were, whether you'd do the right thing or take the easy path." Grace smiled. "You're choosing right, and because of that, I'm prepared to help." Eleanor left me a small trust. Not a fortune, but something. "I'm prepared to donate $50,000 to the Restoration Fund." Hal stared at her. "Grace, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Eleanor would have wanted this. The house preserved, open to the public, serving its original purpose in a new way." Grace pulled an envelope from her purse. "There's something else. Letters between Eleanor and Clifton's great-nephew, discussing the family history. You should have them. They provide context for the journals." After Grace left, Hal opened the envelope with trembling hands. The letters spanned from 1968 to 1975. Written in Eleanor Ashford's careful script, Hal read them in chronological order, learning more about the woman who had preserved Clifton's legacy and the house's hidden history. But it was the final letter that changed everything. Dated March 1975, just months before Eleanor's death, it described in detail the contents of the hidden room, not just what Hal had already found, but something else. A second hidden compartment, concealed within the first. "The brass compass in the study desk," Eleanor had written. "Press the back of it 3 times firmly. The top left drawer has a false bottom." What Clifton hid there was meant only for someone who truly understood his mission. Hal's hands trembled as he finished reading. He went immediately to the study, took out the brass compass, and pressed its back 3 times. The compass clicked. Something released in the desk drawer. Hal opened it and carefully removed the contents. Beneath a thin wooden panel lay another compartment, and inside it, documents that made everything he'd found before pale in comparison. Bank documents, investment certificates, land deeds, all in Clifton Ashford's name, all dated from the 1890 seconds. And a letter, addressed, "To whoever finds this room and chooses preservation over profit." Hal unfolded the letter with shaking hands and began to read. "If you are reading this, you have made the choice I hoped someone would make. You have chosen to honor the work over personal gain. Because of this, I am entrusting you with the means to continue that work. The assets detailed here are to be used solely for the preservation of this house and the education of future generations. Use them wisely. Use them well. The fight for justice never ends, it only changes form." The documents detailed investments and land holdings that Ashford had set aside specifically for this purpose. Hal's hands shook as he read through them. There were railroad bonds, mining stocks, parcels of land in what were now developed areas. Modern values were impossible to calculate without expert assessment, but even conservative estimates suggested significant worth. Clifton Ashford had left an endowment. He'd planned for this moment, had trusted that someday someone would come along who would choose rightly, and he'd left them the means to succeed. Hal sat down heavily. The papers spread before him, overwhelmed by the weight of being trusted by a man who'd been dead for over a century. This changed everything. With an endowment, the museum project became not just possible, but viable. They could properly restore the house, create meaningful educational programs, preserve the collection in perpetuity. He called Patricia immediately, even though it was nearly midnight. "I found something else," he said when she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Another hidden compartment. Ashford left an endowment." "What?" Hal, slow down. He planned for this. He set aside assets specifically for whoever found the room and chose to preserve it. There are documents, investments, land deeds. I don't know what they're worth now. But I'm coming over, Patricia said. First thing in the morning. Don't touch anything else tonight. But Hal couldn't stop looking at the documents, reading and rereading Ashford's letter. The man had been so certain, so confident, that eventually someone would make the right choice. Had he imagined someone like Hal? A desperate man with nothing to lose and everything to prove? Morning came too slowly. Hal was already up, coffee made from his camping stove, when Patricia arrived at 7 with 2 colleagues, an attorney specializing in historic estates and a financial advisor who worked with non-profits. They spent 3 hours examining the documents, making preliminary assessments, discussing implications. These railroad bonds, the financial advisor said, if they were properly maintained through the estate, could be worth considerable money. The land deeds. Several of these parcels are now in developed urban areas. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. How long to determine actual value? Hal asked. Weeks, possibly months, the attorney said. We'll need to trace ownership, verify the assets still exist, determine current market values. This is complex work. But it's legitimate? Hal pressed. Ashford really did this? It appears so. This was carefully planned. He created a trust structure, set aside specific assets, left clear instructions. It's actually quite sophisticated for the 1,890 seconds. Patricia looked at Hal. Do you understand what this means? With an endowment we can do this properly. Full restoration, professional staff, comprehensive programming. The Ashford House could become a major historical site. If the assets are really worth what we think, the attorney cautioned, let's not count chickens before they hatch. But Hal could see it now, the vision becoming real. The mansion restored to its Victorian glory, the hidden room properly preserved and displayed, school groups coming to learn, researchers accessing the archives. Everything Ashford had hoped for, finally realized. That evening, he called Isabel to tell her the news. Dad, this is incredible. You found buried treasure. Not treasure exactly. More like a gift across time. Still counts as treasure in my book. So, what happens now? Now we wait for the assessment, but if it's worth what they think, we can actually do this. Turn the house into a real museum. I'd have a real job, real stability. And you'd be honoring the legacy, Isabel finished. Dad, I'm proud of you. I know this hasn't been easy, but you're doing something amazing here. After they hung up, Hal walked through the mansion, seeing it with new eyes. Not just a shelter, not just a project, but a mission. A continuation of work that had started over a century ago. But his moment of optimism was short-lived. 2 days later, Randall Peck appeared at the mansion, his expression cold. I heard you found more documents. An endowment. News traveled fast in small towns. That's correct. My offer still stands. 400,000. But it's now or never, Dorsey. Once you start this museum process, you'll be locked in. Years of construction, bureaucratic red tape, constant fundraising. Take the money while you can. The answer is no. Peck's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. I've talked to my attorneys. There are questions about the validity of this endowment. Assets that old, ownership could be disputed. You could end up with nothing. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. But fine. Do it your way. Just remember I gave you a chance. After Peck left, Hal called the attorney who'd been reviewing the endowment documents. Peck's threatening legal action. Says there might be disputes about asset ownership. The attorney sighed. There's always that risk with historic estates. But Ashford was meticulous. Everything we've seen suggests proper documentation. Peck's probably bluffing, trying to scare you into selling. Probably? Nothing's certain in law, but don't let him intimidate you. We'll do this right. Verify everything. Make sure it's ironclad. Hal hung up, feeling less certain than he had before. What if Peck was right? What if the endowment turned out to be worthless, tied up in legal disputes, impossible to access? He'd be committed to a museum project without the funding to complete it, stuck in a half-renovated mansion with no clear path forward. But then he thought about Ashford's letter, about the careful planning, the trust placed in whoever would find these documents. Ashford had been smart, methodical, thorough. He wouldn't have left something this important to chance. That weekend, Isabel arrived with her two friends, Kara, her roommate, and a young man named Jack who was studying architecture. They pulled up in a borrowed van filled with tools, supplies, and youthful energy that made Hal feel both old and grateful. Isabel hugged him tight. "Show me everything, Dad. I want to see it all." He took them through the mansion, watching their faces as they saw the scale of it, the decay and the potential existing side by side. Jack kept stopping to examine architectural details, asking intelligent questions about construction techniques and period-appropriate restoration methods. In the hidden room, Isabel stood silent for a long moment, reading one of Ashford's journal entries. "He was brave," she said finally. "Doing this work when it was dangerous, when most people wouldn't, and then trusting that someone would find it and understand. That's the part that scares me," Hal admitted. "What if I'm not worthy of that trust? What if I mess this up?" Isabel turned to face him. "Dad, you were homeless 3 months ago. You spent your last dollar on this place. You've been living without heat or running water, working 2 jobs, trying to make something work. If that's not worthy, I don't know what is." They spent the weekend working, cleaning, repairing, beginning the massive task of making the house presentable. Jack helped Hal install a real window in the library. Kara organized the camping equipment into something less chaotic. Isabel scrubbed walls and swept floors, laughing at the absurdity of it all. On Sunday evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set, Kara asked the question Hal had been avoiding. What happens if the endowment doesn't work out? If Peck's right and there are legal problems? Hal looked at his daughter, at her friends, at the mansion behind them. "Then we figure something else out. But we don't give up. Ashford didn't give up when things were hard. Neither will I." Isabel squeezed his hand. "Neither will we, Dad. You're not alone in this." And for the first time since finding the hidden room, Hal believed it might actually be true. The endowment assessment took 3 weeks. During that time, Hal existed in a state of anxious limbo, working at the hardware store during the day and on the mansion in the evenings, trying not to obsess over outcomes he couldn't control. The attorney, Constance Wright, called regular updates. Some of the assets had been sold decades ago, their value distributed to heirs who couldn't be traced. Others had appreciated significantly, particularly the land parcels in areas that had since urbanized. The railroad bonds were more complicated, requiring extensive research into corporate mergers and successor companies. "We're building the case," Constance assured him, "but it's slow work." Meanwhile, word of the discovery had spread beyond Ironwood Springs. A regional newspaper ran a feature story about the homeless man who'd bought a mansion for $1 and found hidden treasure. The article was mostly accurate, though it romanticized some details and made Hal uncomfortable with its focus on his personal struggles. But it brought attention. And with attention came both opportunity and complication. A film crew from a documentary series about American history contacted Patricia, interested in featuring the Ashford House. 2 major museums expressed interest in the collection. A philanthropist who funded historical preservation projects reached out about potential support. But Randall Peck also escalated his efforts. He filed paperwork with the county, claiming that several of the land parcels in the endowment documents actually belonged to his development company through a series of historical transactions. His lawyers argued that Ashford's trust had been improperly maintained, that assets had been abandoned, that current ownership was disputed. "It's harassment," Constance said when Hal called her in a panic after receiving notice of Peck's claim. "He's throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. But it means we need to accelerate our authentication process. I've brought in a specialist in 19th century property law. We're going to fight this." "How much is this costing?" Hal asked. "I can't afford." "I'm doing this pro bono," Constance interrupted. "This case is fascinating from a legal perspective, and I believe in what you're trying to do. Don't worry about my fees." But Hal worried anyway. He worried about the mansion's failing roof. He worried about the structural issues that were worse than initial assessments had suggested. He worried about the community's expectations and his own ability to deliver. Pierce found him one evening sitting in his truck outside the hardware store, staring at nothing. "You look like hell," Pierce observed, leaning against the driver's door. "Feel like it too. You know what your problem is? You're trying to carry this whole thing by yourself. But you've got people who want to help." "I don't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Pierce laughed. "Hal, you've given this town something to care about, something that matters. The Ashford House project, it's brought people together, made us feel like we're part of something bigger than our dying little town. Let us help." That weekend, Pierce organized a community meeting at the town hall. Hal stood at the front of the room, looking at over 100 faces, townspeople, regional history enthusiasts, preservationists from across the state. "I won't lie to you," Hal began. "This project is in trouble. We need the endowment to work out, but that's tied up in legal disputes. The house needs immediate structural work that I can't afford, and there's a developer trying to take the property." He paused, looking around the room. "I could give up. Sell to Peck, take the money, walk away. Part of me wants to. But then I think about Clifton Ashford, about the work he did, the trust he placed in whoever would find what he'd preserved. And I think about what we could create here, a place where people learn, where history comes alive, where the past speaks to the present." "What do you need?" Someone called from the back. "Everything," Hal said honestly. "Money, labor, expertise, patience. This is going to take years, and I can't promise it'll work." A man Hal didn't recognize stood up. "I'm Lloyd Hayes. I own the lumber yard over in Hartfield. I'd like to donate materials for the emergency roof repairs. Cost, not retail." A woman near the front raised her hand. "I'm an electrical contractor. I'll do the rewiring at cost, and I'll talk to my suppliers about donations." More hands went up. A plumber offered services. A security company offered a system. Teachers pledged to bring their classes. The diner owner committed to feeding volunteers. By the end of the meeting, they'd added $70,000 in cash pledges and over $100,000 in donated services and materials. Grace Sutherland approached afterward. "Eleanor would be proud. So would Clifton." "I hope so," Hal said, his voice rough with emotion. Pierce clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you. You're not alone in this." The following week brought both hope and setback. Constance called with good news. She'd found documentation proving that Peck's claim on the land parcels was baseless. The properties had never left the Ashford Trust, and his development company had no legitimate claim. "We're filing a motion to dismiss his challenge. It's frivolous and he knows it." But the structural engineer's report revealed more problems. The east wing wasn't just at risk, it was actively failing. The foundation was compromised, settling unevenly, threatening the entire section of the house. "You need to stabilize this within the next month," the engineer told Hal, "or you'll lose the east wing entirely. Maybe more." The cost, $75,000 for emergency stabilization. Hal looked at the community pledges. They had $70,000 in donations and services, but most of that was already committed to other repairs. The immediate cash available was maybe $30,000. He called Patricia. "We're short by $45,000, and we have a month. Let me make some calls. There might be emergency preservation grants." But Hal knew grants took time, and time was something they didn't have. That evening, he sat in the hidden room, surrounded by Ashford's journals, feeling the weight of impossible decisions. His phone rang. Peck's name appeared on the screen. Hal almost didn't answer. Then, curiosity won out. "Mr. Dorsey, I hear you're having structural problems. News travels fast." "It does. Here's the thing, my offer is now 800,000, final and non-negotiable. You have 72 hours to accept. After that, I withdraw the offer and let the house collapse. Then I'll buy the land from the county for taxes." "You're assuming I'll fail. I'm counting on it. 72 hours, Dorsey. Think carefully." After Peck hung up, Hal sat in the darkness, thinking about choices and consequences. 800,000 would solve everything. He could pay off his debts, give Isabel the financial security she deserved, start over somewhere else. But it would mean abandoning Ashford's trust, abandoning the community that had rallied around this project, abandoning the part of himself that believed some things mattered more than money. He pulled out his phone and called Isabel. "Dad, it's late. Is everything okay? I need to talk through something." Peck offered 800,000, but accepting means giving up on the museum, on everything we've been working toward. "What do you want to do?" I want to tell him no, but I'm scared. I'm being stupid, throwing away money we desperately need because of pride or stubbornness or— "Dad," Isabel interrupted gently, "you're not being stupid, you're being principled. There's a difference. Principles don't pay bills. No, but they let you look at yourself in the mirror. Listen, I've been watching what you've built there. Not just the house, the community around it, the purpose. You're different than you were 3 months ago. You're not just surviving anymore. You're building something that matters. Don't give that up." After they hung up, Hal sat with his daughter's words. She was right. He was different. The work, the mission, the community, it had given him back something he'd lost. Self-respect, purpose, a reason to get up each morning that went beyond mere survival. He called Patricia. "We have 72 hours and we're short 45,000. What can we do?" "I have an idea. It's unconventional, but it might work." Over the next 2 days, Patricia orchestrated what she called a preservation marathon. They would live-stream the house, share the story, ask for direct public support. It was crowdfunding, essentially, but focused specifically on the emergency structural work. The stream went live on a Thursday evening. Hal stood in the damaged East Wing, camera on a tripod, and told the story, all of it. The homelessness, the dollar bid, the hidden room, Ashford's legacy, and the current crisis. "We have 48 hours to raise $45,000, he said to the camera, "or we lose part of this house forever. I'm asking for help, not for me, but for what this place represents, for the idea that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth choosing over easy money." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations started flowing in within minutes of the stream going live. $5, $10, $25. Some larger, 100, 500. Each one accompanied by a message of support, a story of connection, a belief in what they were trying to do. Hal watched the total climb on Patricia's laptop, barely believing what he was seeing. By midnight, they'd raised $12,000. By morning, 28,000. The local news picked up the story. Then, regional outlets. By Friday afternoon, a national news program called, wanting to do a segment for their weekend broadcast. "This is the kind of story people need right now," the producer told Patricia. "One person standing up for something that matters, a community rallying around them. We'd like to send a crew tomorrow." The news segment aired Saturday evening, reaching millions of viewers. Hal sat in the library with Isabel, who'd driven up for the weekend, watching himself on television talking about Ashford's legacy and the fight to preserve it. "You look good, Dad," Isabel said, confident, like you know exactly what you're doing. "I'm terrified," Hal admitted. What if we don't raise enough? What if the foundation work doesn't hold? What if... His phone buzzed. Patricia calling. Turn on your laptop. Look at the fundraising page. Hal opened the page and stared at the number. $43,000. They were $2,000 short, with 6 hours left before Peck's deadline. It's going to work, Patricia said. We're going to make it. But the last 2,000 came slowly. An hour passed, then another. The deadline loomed 8 p.m. when Peck's offer would expire, and he'd threatened he would shift to simply waiting for the house to fail. At 7:30, they were still $1,500 short. Hal paced the library, unable to sit still. Isabel sat with her laptop, refreshing the page every few seconds. Dad, look. A donation had just come through, $1,000, from Grace Sutherland. That woman, Hal said, his voice catching. She already gave $50,000. She believes in you, Isabel said simply. 7:45. Still 500 short. 7:52. 300. 7:56. 150. At 7:58, the final donations came through small amounts, $10 and $20, people giving what they could. At 7:59, the total crossed $45,000. Hal sat down heavily, his hands shaking. We did it, Isabel said. Dad, we actually did it. At exactly 8 p.m., Hal's phone rang. Peck's number. Hal answered. The offer's expired, Peck. We're not selling. Silence on the other end. Then, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. He hung up and looked at Isabel. For the first time in months, her eyes were shining with tears. I'm so proud of you, she said. I know this has been hard. I know you've sacrificed everything, but you chose right. You chose what mattered. Sunday morning, Doctor. Renee Chastain arrived, the structural engineer who'd provided the initial assessment. She brought with her a crew and equipment, ready to begin the emergency stabilization. I saw your story on the news, she said. I'd like to help. The foundation work, I'll supervise it personally, and I've got contractors willing to work at cost. We'll make sure this house stands. Why? Hal asked. Why are you doing this? Dr. Chastain smiled. Because my great-grandmother's name is in that ledger upstairs. She was helped through this house in 1889. She went on to become a teacher, to raise 6 children, to build a life. I exist because Clifton Ashford chose to help people. Consider this me paying forward a debt that's over a century old. Over the next week, work began in earnest. The foundation stabilization was complex, requiring careful excavation and reinforcement. Dr. Chastain and her crew worked methodically, explaining each step to Hal, teaching him as they went. Volunteers continued to arrive, people from the community, from neighboring towns, from across the state. Some stayed for a day, others for a week. They cleared debris, repaired windows, painted walls, brought the house slowly back to life. Pierce coordinated everything with military precision, organizing crews, managing supplies, ensuring the work was done properly. This is what community looks like, he told Hal one evening. People choosing to be part of something bigger than themselves. Meanwhile, Constance was making progress on the endowment. She'd verified ownership of 3 of the land parcels. Their current value was approximately $350,000. The railroad bonds, after extensive research, were worth another $200,000. Other assets were still being traced, but what they'd confirmed was enough. With proper management, this endowment can fund the museum's operations indefinitely, she told Hal. Ashford knew what he was doing. He built something that would last. 6 weeks after the fundraising marathon, the structural work was complete. The east wing was stabilized, the foundation secure. The house would stand, Patricia organized a small celebration, nothing fancy, just the core volunteers and supporters gathered in the front yard on a Saturday afternoon. Pierce grilled burgers. Grace brought her famous potato salad. Someone set up speakers and played music from the 1890 seconds, a nod to the house's history. Hal stood on the porch, looking at the gathered crowd, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. These people had saved him as much as they'd saved the house. They'd given him community, purpose, a reason to keep going. Isabel appeared beside him, handing him a bottle of water. "You did it, Dad. You actually pulled it off." "We did it," Hal corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "No," Isabel agreed. "But you were the one who started it, who believed it was possible, who chose to honor Ashford's legacy instead of taking the easy money." Hal looked at his daughter, strong, confident, proud of him. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, living in his truck, hiding his circumstances from her, feeling like a failure. He was still far from perfect, still struggling in many ways, but he wasn't that man anymore. "Belle, I need to tell you something. When I bought this place, I was at the bottom. I didn't just lose the apartment, I'd lost myself, lost any sense of who I was or what I was worth. This house, in this project, it gave me back something I didn't know how to find on my own. Purpose," Isabel said. "More than that, it gave me back the ability to believe I could do something that mattered, that I was worth more than my failures." Isabel hugged him tight. "You were always worth more than your failures, Dad. I'm just glad you finally see it." As the sun set over the property, Hal stood with his daughter, surrounded by community, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The museum's opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early October, exactly 8 months after Hal had placed that $1 bid. The renovation wasn't complete, the 3rd floor still needed work, and several rooms remained closed to the public, but the main spaces were ready. The hidden room had been transformed into a climate-controlled gallery. The 1st floor had been restored to period-appropriate elegance. The grounds had been cleared and landscaped by volunteers. Hal woke early that morning in his small apartment in the renovated guest wing. It was modest, a bedroom, a sitting area, a kitchenette, but it was his. Real furniture, real walls, a real home. He dressed carefully in a suit Isabel had helped him pick out, then walked through the house one final time before visitors would arrive. Every room held memories. Now the library where he'd first slept on the floor, the study where he'd discovered the hidden panel, the east wing where they'd fought to save the foundation. Patricia found him in the entry hall, adjusting the banner they'd hung. Grand opening, the Ashford House Museum and Education Center. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," Hal admitted. "What if people don't come? What if we've built all this, and no one cares?" "They'll come. Trust me." She was right. By 10 o'clock, an hour before the scheduled opening, a line had already formed on the front lawn. Townspeople, regional history enthusiasts, reporters, students, families. Over 300 people had come to see what had been saved, what had been built. State officials arrived, representatives from the Historical Commission, Dr. Kimball, and her colleagues from the university. Grace Sutherland, dressed in her Sunday best, walking with quiet pride. Pierce, looking uncomfortable in dress clothes, but grinning broadly. And Isabel, who'd driven up with her roommate and Jack, the architecture student who'd helped months ago and had since become a regular volunteer at the site. At 11 o'clock, Patricia called for quiet. She stood on the front porch with Hal, a red ribbon stretched across the entrance. 8 months ago, Patricia said, this house was dying, forgotten, abandoned, one strong wind away from collapse. Today, it begins a new life as a place of learning, inspiration, and remembrance. This happened because one man made an extraordinary choice to preserve rather than profit, to honor history rather than exploit it, to believe in something bigger than himself. She turned to Hal. "Would you like to say a few words?" Hal stepped forward, his heart pounding. He looked at the crowd, hundreds of faces, many he recognized, many he didn't. All of them here because of choices he'd made, risks he'd taken, faith he'd somehow found when he had nothing else. "I bought this house for $1, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I was homeless, desperate, out of options. I thought maybe this place could give me shelter. What I didn't know was that it would give me so much more." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Clifton Ashford built this house to serve a purpose beyond himself. He used his resources to help people who had nothing, who were starting over, who needed someone to believe in them. In a way, he helped me too across more than a century. He left behind not just a house and a collection, but a lesson that what we do matters more than what we own. That legacy is built through service, not accumulation. Hal looked at Isabel, standing in the front row, her eyes bright. "My daughter asked me once what Mr. Ashford would want us to do with what we found. I think the answer is this: share it, preserve it, use it to teach and inspire. Make it something that serves others, just as he did." He gestured to the house behind him. "This isn't my museum. It belongs to all of us, to this community that saved it, to the history it preserves, to the future generations who'll learn from it. Thank you for believing in this vision. Thank you for helping make it real." Patricia handed him the scissors. "The honor is yours." Hal cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in applause. The doors opened, and people streamed inside. Trained docents, volunteers from the community led tours, explaining the house's history and Ashford's work. In the hidden room, visitors stood in reverent silence, reading journal entries, viewing the artifacts, connecting with stories that had waited over a century to be told. Hal moved through the crowds, answering questions, accepting congratulations, feeling simultaneously proud and humbled. A woman approached him in tears, explaining that her great-great-grandfather's name was in the ledger. She'd never known his story before today. "Thank you," she said, gripping his hands. "Thank you for preserving this, for giving my family back a piece of ourselves." By late afternoon, over 400 people had toured the house. The guest book was filled with comments: inspiring, necessary, beautiful. Teachers scheduled field trips. Researchers requested access to the archives. A university professor inquired about bringing graduate students for a summer seminar. As the last visitors departed, Hal stood on the front porch with Isabel, Patricia, Pierce, and Grace, watching the sun set over the property. "We did it," Pierce said, shaking his head in wonder. "We actually pulled this off." "You did it," Grace corrected, looking at Hal. "You chose right, and you never gave up. Eleanor and Clifton would both be proud." That evening, after everyone had left, Hal and Isabel sat in the library, the room where this journey had truly begun. "How does it feel?" Isabel asked. "Surreal, like I'm going to wake up back in the truck and discover this was all a dream." "It's not a dream, Dad. It's real. You made it real." Hal looked at his daughter. "I couldn't have done it without you. Your support, your belief that kept me going when I wanted to quit." "That's what family does," Isabel said simply. "We believe in each other, especially when it's hard to believe in ourselves." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Isabel asked, "What happens now? Now we keep going?" "The museum runs 3 days a week. I'll manage operations, give tours, work with researchers. The endowment provides enough for me to live on, to keep the place maintained. It's not glamorous, but it's meaningful," Isabel finished. "That's better than glamorous." Hal nodded. "It is. For the first time in years, I wake up with purpose, with something to build toward, instead of just trying to survive." "That's everything, Dad." Later, after Isabel had gone to her hotel, Hal stood alone in the hidden room, the Ashford Freedom Room, as they'd officially named it. He thought about the journey that had led him here, about the desperation and the choices and the impossible faith that somehow things could be better. He thought about Clifton Ashford, about Eleanor, about all the people whose stories were preserved in this space. And he thought about his own story still being written, still unfinished, but finally moving in a direction that felt right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work would continue, but tonight Hal allowed himself to simply be grateful for second chances, for community, for purpose, for home. 3 months after the opening, winter settled over Ironwood Springs. Snow covered the mansion's grounds, transforming it into something from a Victorian postcard. The museum ran its reduced winter schedule, weekends only, but visitors still came, drawn by the story and the history preserved within these walls. Hal stood at the window of his apartment, coffee in hand, watching morning light paint the snow gold. This view, this moment, this life, all of it still felt improbable. But it was real, solid. The endowment had been fully settled. After legal fees and administrative costs, it provided an annual operating budget of $60,000. Combined with admission fees, grants and donations, the museum was financially stable, not wealthy, but sustainable. Hal's salary was modest, $45,000 a year plus housing, but it was more than enough. He'd learned to live simply during those months in the truck. Now, with a roof over his head and meaningful work each day, he felt rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. His phone buzzed. A text from Isabel. "Finishing finals today. Coming up this weekend to celebrate. Bring Jack?" Hal smiled and typed back, "Of course, I'll make up the guest rooms." Isabel had been visiting regularly, usually bringing Jack, who'd become increasingly involved in the museum's restoration projects. The two of them had grown close, and Hal watched their relationship develop with a father's cautious approval. Jack was steady, thoughtful, genuinely passionate about preservation work, good qualities in a young man. The museum had settled into a rhythm. Weekends brought visitors, families, history enthusiasts, school groups. Weekdays, Hal worked on cataloguing, maintenance, correspondence with researchers who wanted access to the archives. Dr. Kimball's team had published several papers based on Ashford's journals, bringing academic attention to the collection. Pierce stopped by most Tuesday afternoons, ostensibly to check on maintenance issues, but really to drink coffee and talk. He'd become Hal's closest friend, the kind of friendship that develops between people who've worked hard together towards something meaningful. Grace visited weekly, bringing baked goods and stories about Eleanor and the town's history. She donated Eleanor's papers to the museum's collection, adding another layer to the archive. Patricia ran the non-profit with quiet efficiency, managing grants, coordinating with the Historical Commission, handling the administrative work that kept everything functioning. She'd become not just a colleague, but a trusted partner in the mission. The house itself continued to reveal secrets. Last month, workers renovating the third floor had found another small cache of letters hidden in a wall cavity. Nothing as significant as the main discovery, but each find added depth to the story, new connections to the past. Hal spent his mornings giving tours, his voice now practiced at telling Ashford's story, explaining the significance of the collection, answering visitors' questions. He'd learned to read groups, to adjust his approach for children versus scholars, to make the history accessible without diminishing its importance. Afternoons were for administrative work, responding to research requests, maintaining the collection, planning educational programs. Evenings were his own, and he'd fallen into the habit of reading in the library, often from Ashford's own books, feeling a connection across time with the man who'd built this place. He'd started writing too, not for publication, but for himself and for whoever might come after him, just as Ashford had written for whoever would find his journals. Hal documented the restoration process, the decisions made, the lessons learned. He wrote about the community that had saved this place, about second chances and choosing meaning over money. One evening, working in the study, Hal received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Thank you from Philadelphia." He opened it and read, "Mr. Dorsey, my name is William Ashford. I am Clifton Ashford's great-great-great-nephew. I only recently learned about your museum through a genealogy research project. I wanted to reach out and express my family's profound gratitude for what you've done. For years, we knew little about Clifton beyond basic facts. What you've preserved and shared has given us back a piece of our family history we didn't know existed. I would like to visit this spring, if that's acceptable. I have some family documents that might complement your collection, letters to Clifton from his parents, photographs, small items. I think they belong there, in the house, as part of the complete story. Thank you for choosing preservation over profit. Thank you for honoring my ancestors' legacy. Sincerely, William Ashford. Hal read the email twice, then sat back, overwhelmed by the ripple effects of the choices he'd made. Ashford's own family, reconnecting with history because of this work. It was exactly what Clifton had hoped for. Stories preserved, connections made, legacy honored. He replied immediately, welcoming William, expressing gratitude for the additional materials, marveling at how the circle kept expanding. That weekend, Isabel arrived with Jack and her roommate Cara. They cooked dinner in Hal's small kitchen, laughing and talking, filling the apartment with noise and life. After dinner, Isabel asked to see the museum after hours, to experience it quietly without crowds. Hal led them through the darkened rooms, the building settling around them with familiar creaks and groans. In the hidden room, illuminated only by display case lighting, they stood reading Ashford's journals. "This never gets old," Jack said quietly. Knowing these words were written over a century ago, preserved all this time, waiting. "Like a message in a bottle," Cara added. "Thrown across time." "Except Ashford knew someone would find it," Isabel said. "He had faith that the right person would come along. And Dad, somehow you were that person." Hal looked at his daughter, at her friends, at the room full of history and hope. "I think I was just desperate enough to take a chance. The rest was luck." "It wasn't luck," Isabel said firmly. "It was choice. You chose to see possibility instead of ruin, to build instead of give up, to honor something bigger than yourself. That wasn't luck, Dad. That was courage." Later, after the young people had gone to bed in the guest rooms, Hal sat at Ashford's desk in the study. The brass compass sat beside his laptop, its engraved message, true north, catching the lamplight. He opened the journal Grace had given him months ago, the one she'd suggested he use to document his own story. He'd filled many pages since then, but tonight he felt compelled to write something different. Not a record of events, but a reflection. 10 months ago, he wrote, I placed a $1 bid on a house I'd never seen, driven by desperation and the faintest hope that things could be different. I didn't know then what I was really bidding on, not just shelter, but purpose. Not just a house, but a mission. Not just survival, but a life worth living. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Clifton Ashford wrote that wealth is not what we accumulate, but what we do with what we have. I came here with nothing, no money, no home, no prospects. What I had was $1 and the willingness to take a chance. What I found was infinitely more valuable than money. Community, purpose, connection, meaning. I don't know who will read this or when. Maybe no one. Maybe someday another desperate person will find themselves in this house looking for answers. If that's you, know this. Second chances are real. Rock bottom has a trapdoor. And sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. Choose courage over comfort. Choose purpose over profit. Choose to believe that what you do matters, because it does. The ripples extend further than you can imagine. Hal closed the journal and turned off the lamp. He walked through his apartment, small but sufficient, modest but his, and looked out at the mansion grounds covered in snow. The house stood solid and permanent, lit by exterior lights, its windows glowing warmly. Inside, history was preserved. Outside, the future waited. And Hal, once homeless and desperate, now curator and caretaker, felt something he hadn't felt in years: complete. Not because everything was perfect, there were still challenges, still repairs needed, still work to be done, but because he'd found what he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. He'd found home, not just a place, but a purpose, not just shelter, but meaning. And that, he thought as he finally went to bed, was worth more than any fortune. The Ashford house stood through the night, its stories preserved, its mission alive, its legacy continued by a man who'd bought it for $1 and discovered it was priceless.